As we all know, the last 5 years have been incredibly difficult for the majority of people in this country. To varying degrees, people's incomes have come under sustained attack, their living standards have worsened, and their future plans have had to be changed. Above all else, people look to the government to give them hope that there are better days ahead. Including today's budget, a staggering total adjustment of in excess of €30 billion has been introduced in the public finances since 2008. We all hope that the country is on the cusp of recovery, but I believe it is too early to draw any definitive conclusions on that front. All of us in politics, but particularly those in government, have a responsibility to ensure that all the sacrifices that have been made by people are worthwhile, and that Ireland is put firmly on the road to a sustainable recovery. It means staying focused on the task that lies ahead. Fianna Fáil believes that a budget adjustment of a similar order to that proposed by government is required. We accept that there is no easy way of putting through tax increases and spending cuts of the order of €2.5 billion. However, the litmus test of this budget is not the response of the opposition. The litmus test of this budget is whether or not the people outside of this House, those who are most affected by its measures, believe it to be fair. I am not naive enough to think that you can achieve a consensus on what constitutes fairness. But our definition of fairness is whether or not the burden of the adjustment has been spread in line with people's ability to carry it. I believe that by any reasonable analysis, today's budget is the third successive budget of this government that places a disproportionate share of that burden on those who are least able to carry it. This is a budget that has overpromised and underdelivered. And when you strip away all of the PR that we've heard in recent days, this is a budget that targets the elderly. It targets those who hold medical cards. It targets young mothers. It abandons people struggling to keep their home. And yet again, incredibly, the government has gone out of its way to insulate the better off from the worst effects of this budget. Minister, the way that pensioners in particular have been targeted in this budget is nothing short of disgraceful. They are our parents, our grandparents, people who have lived through far greater hardship than any of us can appreciate today. And not only will many of them now lose their medical card, they will have higher prescription charges, they will lose their telephone allowance, their bereavement grant is gone, and dirt tax is going up. Even the dead, Minister, are not safe from this government. As if it isn't enough to take a property tax from the estate of those who are deceased, but the modest grant that their loved one gets to give them the dignity of a decent burial is now being removed by this government. Minister, in a famous quip a few years ago to the then Minister Brian Lenihan, you asked what he had against the third child. Well, I have a question for you today, Minister, and that is, what have you got against young mothers? Because it is only a short 3 months ago that you introduced tax at the marginal rate on their maternity benefit, taking up to €108 per week out of the pockets of young mothers. And now today we have another €32 a week being taken out of the pockets of those same women. That's a cut of €140 per week, Minister, from the pockets of women who have just given birth to babies in this country. Where is that coming from? Where's the logic in that? I simply cannot understand it. The strategy behind this budget seems to be to divide and conquer, to isolate the weaker sections of society, those on the margins, and to do so in a way that maximises political advantage for Fine Gael and Labour. In recent days, we have been bombarded with spin from the government parties that the coping classes, that those who pay for everything in this country, as they put it, would somehow be given a break in this budget. Unfortunately, when the reality of this budget sinks in, many people will be left bitterly disappointed when it becomes clear what the budget actually means for them and their families. The tone of self-congratulation coming out of government buildings will ring hollow tonight when people realise the full extent of it. In many ways, Minister, the opposition spokespersons are standing up here to respond to a budget that we have not yet seen. Yes, we have your speeches. Yes, we have the booklets that have been distributed, but shortly individual ministers will go off to press conferences in their own offices, and they will explain then what the budget means in respect of their own line department. And it is only then that we will find out the full extent of the cuts and the increases that are buried in the detail of this budget. That detail is often carefully drip-fed out in the hope that it will hardly be noticed. And a full assessment of the budget can only be made once we have all the facts to hand. I know my colleague, Deputy Sean Fleming, will be highlighting some of the cuts in particular that have not been mentioned in the Minister's speeches, but which will become very clear on any analysis of the booklets. It is often the case that in the hours and days immediately after a budget, an issue takes on a life of its own. When its full magnitude is realised in this budget, that issue could well be removing the telephone allowance, not just from pensioners, but from carers, from blind people, from people on disability allowance. The truth is that most people, Minister, don't go to bed worrying about the general government deficit, the debt to GDP ratio, or indeed the yield in government bonds, though all of those metrics are certainly important. But they worry about the ordinary things, Minister. They worry about putting food on the table. They worry about paying their mortgage. They worry about paying their electricity bill. At this time of year, they begin to worry about providing for Christmas. They certainly worry about holding on to the job they have, if they're lucky enough to have one, or finding a job if they have not. And it is only when people see things getting a little easier will they accept that the economy is really recovering in a way that is meaningful and holds relevance for them. Halfway through your term in government, it is a good time to take stock of where you said the economy would be at this time and where we actually are today. I believe that the fairest and most important measures of economic performance are growth, jobs and the public finances. On growth, Minister, the economy has not performed anywhere near the level that you and your colleagues predicted that it would when you first came to office about 2.5 years ago. Back then you said the economy would grow by 5.5% from the beginning of 2012 to the end of the current year. You're now estimating that over that period it will have grown, if we're lucky, by 0.4%. That's a prediction of 5.5% versus a reality of 0.4% of growth in the economy. The truth is that we have had little or no growth at all over the last 2 years, and the forecast for next year has now been downgraded for the third time since you came to office. The predicted growth rates of 2% and 3% are always for next year or the year after, but they never seem to arrive. The economy today is about €5 billion smaller than you said it would be at this time when you came to office. Of course, it goes without saying, Minister, that the weak external environment has been a drag on our exports, and that fact, alongside a struggling domestic economy, has resulted in an overall economy that remains fragile and largely flat. Where the government has scored best is on the public finances. On coming to office, you predicted that the deficit at the end of this year would be 7.2%, and it's now going to come in at around 7.3%, and that is to be welcomed. Fianna Fáil welcomes the fact the reduction on the deficit remains on target. And I'm sure you will acknowledge, both ministers, that the progress on the public finances is not limited to your tenure in the departments, but also due to the work of your predecessor in the latter years of the previous government. Our deficit, while still high, is continuing to come down, and the achievement of a deficit below 5% in the current year is an important step in the milestone of achieving a deficit within 3% by the end of next year. However, there has been a marked difference in how you've gone about bringing about that adjustment. Your measures to date have unquestionably been regressive. They have targeted those on low and middle incomes in particular. They have borne the brunt of your budgets, and the very wealthiest in this country have been asked to contribute precious little. On jobs, there has undoubtedly been an improvement in the jobs market in recent months, and that has to be welcomed. As far as I'm concerned, every single new job, whether it be a part-time job or a full-time job, is good news. But we all accept that the level of unemployment in this country remains a national crisis, and the scale of the task ahead is immense. And let's look at the facts. The official measure of unemployment is the CSO Quarterly Household Survey, and according to the latest figures, the number of people officially unemployed has fallen since March 2011 by less than 7,000 people, from over 307,000 to over 300,000 people. Over the same period, the number of people in unemployment has increased by 12,700, in employment, and now stands at 1.866 million people. It is true that the more recent data is more encouraging, and hopefully a real dent can be put on the unemployment numbers over the period ahead. But all of that is a far cry indeed from the promise of 100,000 net new jobs that we heard from the government on coming into office. And job creation, Minister, in the private sector has undoubtedly played a role in the reduction in the live register, but so too has forced emigration. We know that in the last 2 years, for which we have full data, 2011 and 2012, that almost 170,000 people emigrated from our shores. Of those, almost 90,000 people were Irish nationals. There is not a town or a village in this country that has not been affected by the scourge of emigration. And the fact is, Minister, that this government is actively encouraging people to emigrate. That is the harsh reality. I have a letter here, Minister, that was sent by the Department of Social Protection to somebody on the live register who was formerly employed in construction. And it's telling them about a job vacancy in their area. Not a vacancy in Cork, in Limerick or in Dublin, but a job vacancy in Canada. This is a letter from your government. This is a letter from the Department of Social Protection to an individual who is looking for a job in this country.
Sorry, please.
The letter goes on, Minister, to give a detailed description of what the job in Canada would involve, and that if the person is interested, they should send their CV to an email address within the Irish Department of Social Protection. And so anxious, Minister, so anxious, if I may.
This is hurting, lads.
Can I please come?
Sorry, would you please restrain yourself? We want to hear what he has to say, and then you have your say afterwards. Now, will you stay quiet on all sides? Thank you very much.
So anxious, Minister, was the government...
You didn't hear me, Minister, did you? Minister, you didn't hear me. And that applies to ministers as well as backbenchers. Thank you.
Just like the Tesco ad, the truth hurts here as well. So anxious was the government, Minister, to assist that person to apply for the job in Canada, that they provided information on the format of CV that Canadian employers like to see. That is the truth. A letter from the Irish government. And the person was informed on the back of the letter of a whole range of vacancies in Canada that they could apply for. Vacancies in cabinet making, carpentry, fence building, glazier, finishing carpentry, and so forth. Now, Minister, when you combine that letter, which God knows how many people have received from the Department of Social Protection, with your decision today to cut the job seekers allowance rate for young people, then what message does it send out to the young people of Ireland? It gives them the message that you're not wanted here, there is no future in this country for you, you're better off going abroad and going to Canada. That is the message that people will hear from the budget today and what they are being written to by the Department of Social Protection. While multinationals, Minister, remain a critically important part of our economy, Fianna Fáil believes that not enough attention had been paid to the indigenous economy and in particular small and medium-sized enterprises. You have announced a number of measures in your package today, Minister, which, to be frank, are underwhelming, and to use your own terminology, there are a few bits and bobs, and that's about it. Nothing of any great significance that I can see. I sincerely hope that they are far more successful than the measures that you introduced last year. The take-up, as we know, on the microfinance loan scheme has been minimal. It's already under review. The temporary partial loan guarantee scheme, again, has had an exceptionally low take-up and is being re-examined already because of its limited application. You're giving a 2-year tax holiday for unemployed people who start up a new business, and you're providing for a whopping €1 million as a cost, because you know well, Minister, that unemployed people starting a new business, the last thing that they're worried about is their taxation bill and the profits for the first 2 years. And that's the kind of window dressing that we have from this government when it comes to job creation. To assist in addressing the lack of credit, Minister, which is hampering many businesses, we would like to see far more innovative measures, such as tax relief for individuals making loan capital investment to SMEs. We would like to see a special low capital gains tax rate for new entrepreneurs starting up businesses, not the type of cumbersome rollover relief on capital gains tax that you have announced today. We believe that a state-backed enterprise or investment bank should be considered for the provision of capital to growing businesses. This could be done by means of a standalone bank or using the infrastructure that exists within permanent TSB. Such a model is already well established in Canada, the US, Germany, and is currently under development in the UK. But in many respects, Minister, the main issues that affect small and medium-sized businesses in Ireland today didn't even warrant a mention in the budget. We know electricity prices are going up. We know gas prices are going up for businesses. We know that they are crippled by the burden of local authority rates. We know that revaluations going on right throughout this country are causing havoc for SMEs, leading to, in many cases, dramatic increases in the rates burden that they are facing. We know that the collapse in property values has contaminated a lot of good trading businesses, and I believe there is a need for a new approach in this area. The banks need to be required, Minister, to restructure SME debt to ensure that viable businesses can continue to grow and expand. You are today announcing that illness benefit will not be paid for the first 6 days that the person is out sick, and where the employer does have a policy of sick pay, then they are presumably in many cases going to have to pick up the tab for the extra 3 days that you're announcing. Certainly in relation to the VAT scheme and the increase in the threshold for cash receipts, that is a significant announcement, increasing that to €2 million, and that is certainly to be welcomed. You've announced a number of measures in relation to construction, Minister, and the message that I want to convey today is that the main issue to address in construction and property, if you want to get that sector moving again, is the lack of credit, is the fact that many young people who have been saving, who want to buy a house for the first time, simply can't get a mortgage from our banks. So the priority has to be to fix the banks, to get a normal level of credit flowing in the economy again, to give those people an opportunity to buy a property for the first time again. And there may well be areas, particularly in Dublin, where there is a shortage of certain types of property. But the main issue in the short term, I believe, that needs to be addressed is the lack of credit. Minister, on corporation tax, you have announced a certain change today. You should be under no illusions. Ireland's corporation tax policies are under siege. We need to send out a strong, united message, in my view, from this House, that Ireland values its ability to determine our own corporation tax policies and that our rules are transparent and are in line with OECD guidelines. We need to be far more proactive in making the case definitively for retaining autonomy and setting our own corporation tax rate. And this does need to be a priority for government at the highest level. And none of us should be complacent about the mutterings that we're hearing from Germany about the ongoing negotiations there for the coalition government, whereby Ireland's corporation tax regime has found its way onto the agenda. Let's not be complacent about that. It poses a real and substantial risk to this country, and it needs to be addressed. Last month, the European Commission sought information from Ireland, as we know, on how certain multinationals are treated from a corporation tax point of view. We need to be insisting that preliminary investigation which they have launched is dealt with as quickly as possible, because for as long as it remains open-ended, it is a cloud hanging over our inward investment offering, and it needs to be addressed. The reality is that Ireland is at war to defend our corporation tax rate and system, and what we've been hearing from government until now is that there would be no unilateral change, that we would move along with other countries to implement the OECD initiative on BEPS, that any changes would be part of a coordinated initiative. And what you're announcing today, Minister, is a departure from that. It might be regarded as a minor change, and certainly the whole notion of a double Irish has given us a bad reputation in recent times. Hardly a week goes by now where very significant international newspapers and media outlets are covering this issue. So we need to examine this in great detail. But there has been a departure here from the stated policy up until now that we would move in line with other countries. We are moving unilaterally. Let's see the detail, Minister. I'm not going to play politics with corporation tax. Well, Minister, you have said it's going to be in the finance bill. Let's see what's in the finance bill. Okay. Minister, between 400,000 and 500,000 people will sleep tonight in family homes where the mortgage is in some level of arrears. And alongside unemployment, it is the single greatest economic and social challenge that we are facing in this state. They got a cursory mention, Minister, in your own speech. A cursory mention. It was glanced over. It was clearly a box-ticking exercise for whoever wrote your speech. We better give a mention to mortgage arrears. But there was nothing in it. There was nothing new in it. And the government's response so far to the crisis has been to give the banks more power, to allow them to repossess homes more easily and more quickly, and to dilute key protections the borrowers have had. Today we have 143,000 family home mortgages in arrears, and there is no easy solution to the problem. No one is suggesting that the banks can throw away the capital the taxpayers have given them. They have to be prudent. But one thing is certain, the problem will not be solved if banks are allowed to continue to run the show. Last March, the Central Bank issued targets for the banks to offer sustainable solutions to those in arrears. The government warmly welcomed the new targets programme, but it has since been shown conclusively that the banks have effectively made a mockery of that process, relying on threatening legal letters to reach their targets. Now, you have said that you do not regard a threatening legal letter to be a sustainable solution. Well, let's back up those words now with action, because that's what they're doing, and we await the confirmation from the Central Bank as to whether or not that is acceptable. But in the majority of cases which were presented to the Finance Committee, the solution was to tell the borrower, we want your home back, you either sell it yourself, give us the keys, or we will go to court to repossess it. That was the message from the banks in a majority of cases, and in many cases those threats were made to people before any other forbearance measure was even tried. And the message from government has been, oh, repossession is the last resort. The reality is, in very many cases that I personally know of, and I'm sure every deputy in this House does, that letter was the first action that the banks took in respect of people in mortgage arrears. It is simply not good enough. The banks in this country owe their very existence to our citizens. The least they could afford to do is show some compassion, some civic-mindedness in dealing with mortgage arrears. We need more proper, long-term sustainable solutions, not mere sticking plasters in the short term. We need more permanent interest rate reductions, sustainable split mortgages, debt for equity arrangements. The truth is, we all know it makes far more sense economically and socially to keep people in the family home where that is at all possible. The setting up of the new insolvency service was a welcome initiative, but there is growing evidence already that thousands of the most distressed borrowers in the country who most need access to the service are being locked out because they have no ability at all to repay any of their debts within the insolvency guidelines. And in many cases, they simply cannot afford the fees being charged up front by the personal insolvency practitioners. And this government's singular response today in the budget to the mortgage arrears crisis is to announce that the one payment that people rely on to make interest payments on their mortgage, to try and keep the wolf from the door and to prevent the banks from coming at them, is to abolish mortgage interest supplement for new entrants. That is a shameful decision, Minister. If you were announcing that it was being replaced with a radical new, innovative policy to support those in mortgage arrears, then of course we'd examine it at its merits. But the one safety net that they had, the one direct cash support from government to those in mortgage distress, has now been pulled from under them today. I just cannot understand the logic behind that. It will only make the situation worse. Minister, you have announced a new levy in respect of banks operating in Ireland, and I think it's fair to say nobody will be chaining themselves to the gates outside Kildare Street tonight to protest against the introduction of a bank levy. But the question... Sorry, Minister? Well, he can speak for himself. But I do have to ask the question, Minister, who will end up paying this levy? Will the banks simply be allowed to pass this on to customers by way of increased fees, charges, higher variable rate interest rates, for example? We know that we don't have a properly functioning banking system, and the question does have to be asked as to whether or not this measure will help. And at a time when we are trying to attract more competition in the banking sector in Ireland, I have to ask the question, will the introduction of this levy make it less likely that we will be able to attract competition into the banking sector here? You are removing the restriction on the use of deferred tax assets for NAMA. That's a big win for the banks, and I'd like to see a lot more detail on that. If the banks return to profitability, which I hope they do, what will this actually mean in terms of taxation that they will now not have to pay? I think we need more information on that, Minister, because certainly it would seem to me that there's a far bigger win there for the banks by way of tax that they won't have to pay from the levy that you've announced today. While people are coming to terms today with Budget 2014, the truth is that last year's budget hasn't finished with them yet. Next year, hard-pressed homeowners will be faced with a double local property tax charge. From your point of view, Minister, I'm sure you view the LPT as a major success, bringing in €50 million more than you expected, and with the revenue achieving a very high compliance rate. But with a full year's charge being levied on the 21st of March next year, that is really going to hurt people. That could have significant implications for the domestic economy. And I remain of the view that the tax is unfair in that it doesn't take into account ability to pay in any meaningful way, and it is being levied on those even who cannot afford to make their mortgage repayments. You have announced a very significant change on pension tax relief today, Minister. I do want to ask on a point of equity, does that apply to the highest echelons in the public service? For example, if somebody is continuing to pay into a pension which yields a pension in excess of 60,000, does it mean that their relief will be curtailed as well? I take it that it does from your response. Minister, I see that you have announced that the lower rate VAT is going to be retained in the tourism and hospitality sector. That decision will be warmly welcomed by a sector that has undoubtedly benefited from that announcement. But I do have to raise the issue, Minister, of the pension levy, because in your speech you're announcing that the pension levy is going to end, but in the booklet it says the pension levy is going to increase. And in 2014 it appears to be going from 0.6% to 0.75% and down to 0.15% the following year. So it's one or the other. You can't have it both ways. And the truth is you've played a three-card trick here on the pension levy. Since you announced it back in 2011, you reiterated time and again, and did so again in last year's budget speech, reassuring all of those affected by that levy that it was going to end in 2014. You have now broken your word on that. And that levy, Minister, as you know, has very significant consequences for those who have pension savings. We know the scale of the crisis in defined benefit schemes in particular. We know in the ESB alone there is a deficit of €1.5 billion.
2 minutes remaining.
Okay, thank you very much, Last Ciún Comhairle. So you're not abolishing the pension levy. Let's not play with words. You're increasing it in 2014 and you're reducing it in 2015. And is that the end of it? I said at the time in 2011 that I just did not believe that that levy was going to end in 2014, Minister, and I think people will treat with some cynicism the trick that you have played on the pension levy, and the fact that up until now, and until we shone a light on the fact that the proceeds from the pension levy were being diverted into the general government coffers and were not being used in the Jobs Initiative, I am glad that you have now made further announcements on the Jobs Initiative. Can you clarify, Minister, the higher dirt rate, is there PRSI on top of that of 4%? No, so the 41% is inclusive of PRSI. In relation to excise, again you have left the off-trade untouched. You're targeting the on-trade with your increase in excise duty. But you know our view on this issue. We believe the problem in relation to alcohol sales is in the large multiples, quite frankly, where alcohol is being sold exceptionally cheap. There is a need, in our view, to reduce the enormous discrepancy between the on-trade and the off-trade. You've made no moves whatsoever on that front. You are abolishing the air travel tax from April of next year in an effort to boost tourism. But then, as evidence of the lack of cohesion, on the other hand, you're decreasing the budget for tourism programmes by €13 million. So you're giving on the one hand, you're taking away on the other hand. Minister, I welcome the fact that Ireland is on course to exit the bailout programme in 2 months' time. We do not regard the putting in place of a precautionary line of credit as being in any way a second bailout. We would encourage you to take all necessary prudent steps to ensure that Ireland can exit the bailout in a sustainable way. But I think in many ways the enemy of this government from that point onwards will be complacency, because there are still fundamental reforms needed in sheltered professions, in our banking system, in labour activation that need to be put through. And a lot of work has to be done on that issue. On the IBRC liquidation, Last Ciún Comhairle, we supported that at the time in good faith, and I don't regret that decision. But, Minister, I am not happy with a number of issues that emerged since. I'm not happy that credit unions lost about €14 million because of the way that they were treated. I'm not happy that the employees at the time were shafted from the point of view of redundancy. And I'm not happy that mortgage customers of the former INBS now face the potential risk of losing the protections afforded to them under the Code of Conduct and Mortgage Arrears, depending on who goes ahead and buys the loan book. You need to do a lot more work in respect of the ESM. Wolfgang Schäuble today said it's not probable that we will get a deal retroactively on bank debt recapitalisation. There's a huge body of work to be still done there. You have indicated previously that you're going to do a medium-term economic strategy. And I want to know, Minister, are we asking the big questions about is our debt sustainable, about whether we have a proper funding model in place for third-level education, for pension provision in this country, for pension liabilities, universal health insurance, our vision for Ireland's role in the European Union. Yet again, last count quarter, in Budget 214, this government has targeted some of the weakest among us in society. The basic level of comfort given to our older citizens is being systematically unravelled. Those struggling to keep the family home have got another kick. This is a government that talks about fairness, but does the opposite. It is a government that has set records for broken promises. At a time when people want to see government show compassion, to exemplify the values of this country, to show true leadership, they have been badly let down. I believe this budget fails the basic test of fairness. I believe that even within the accepted constraints, you could have done better. It is now over to the Irish people in this country to pass judgment on Budget 2014.